Remind us, what we've been doing is looking at the core facts that everyone who studies this subject agrees on. Things like that Jesus was real, that he actually died by crucifixion under the Romans, that his followers sincerely believed that they saw him alive again, that Paul the apostle, who was an enemy trying to destroy the church, then became one of its biggest proponents. So we looked at those pieces of information, and this last one that we're looking at is the fact that Jesus' tomb was empty the Sunday after he was crucified. So we said that's not one that virtually everybody agrees with, but it's a large majority of people. And when we looked at the information, you can see why, because even Jesus' enemies were admitting the fact that his body was not in the tomb. And so there needs to be some kind of explanation. I want to show you actual examples of these tombs in what the disciples were seeing, what Jesus was seeing when he was there and when he came out. Because I think it really helps you to sort of touch and feel the stories, to understand what's going on, to see maybe some of the details that are given, why they say, what they're doing, why they're doing that. And it helps it become more real to us, I think, when we can see it in real life. And so just reminding us of what we were talking about. So this is a picture of Jerusalem drawn as it would have probably looked when Jesus was alive. And so we have, this is the city walls. I'm just reminding us of, this is the temple complex. So this would have been the temple, and as you can see, it wasn't just the temple itself, but there was a whole, basically a community center. I mean, there was living quarters and shops and all kinds of things. A lot of these staircases still exist today. And so this was the temple. The Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is praying the night before he is crucified, and the Mount of Olives is all over here by this green arrow. And then where Jesus actually would have been crucified, probably, Golgotha and all that, is the northwest side of town up here. And as Jeff and I were talking about before the class, if you go over here to Jerusalem, there's a tourist attraction called the Garden Tomb, where there's a tradition that Jesus was buried up here. It's really just a tourist attraction. I mean, maybe, I don't know that for sure, but probably not. And so you can go and see all of these things, the extravagant tombs that are up there. We do know that in this general area is where it happened. Remember, we looked at what John said right here. This is just another picture of Jerusalem. So that same area that we're talking about. And he said in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. The Garden Tomb, you can see the jump, say, oh, Jesus must have been buried here. It was a new tomb, and since it was close by, remember the Sabbath was approaching, so they had to get the body off the cross and put it in the tomb so that they weren't defiling themselves on the Sabbath. And so because it was close, they put him here. So Jesus was buried somewhere in here, probably by Golgotha. And so what we have been talking about starting on Wednesday is down here south of town, basically south, across the Hinnom Valley. And we talked a little bit about some of the details of what's going on there. And I talked with some other people after class. And so I think it'd be sort of helpful to discuss some of those details. So the Hinnom Valley, the Sons of Hinnom, it was a famous place. Does anybody remember, except for Brace, because that's who I was talking to, does anybody remember why the Valley of Hinnom, the Sons of Hinnom, and all of that was famous?
It's always burning. It was the trash.
Right, even before that, though. You're right, but that was just a little bit of a joke. So it was famous for worship of Molech and different idols. And in this area was where things like child sacrifice took place. It was just really detestable, horrible things. So then, because of the associations with the things that happened there, they started to burn their garbage in that pit. and they would dump bodies and different things. So it was this horrible landfill that was then burning. And this is where a lot of people, I would say most people, think Jesus is referring to when he uses the word Gehenna and talks about it's always burning and the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, because they would have been able to go outside of town and see all this. So this was a famous area, and just south of this was the field of Hakeldama. Do you remember what that is famous for?
Judas,
Right.
the potters.
Yeah, so Hakeldama, this area down here, there was a cemetery, basically. Cemetery, and they found a lot of tombs there. And this is believed to be where Judas went and committed suicide. In the cemetery, you know, that is something that happens sometimes. And so down there in the cemetery, Hakeldama, the field of blood, the potter's field. So that's all the area that's believed that Judas went and did what he did. And so we're talking about all this south of town, the tombs that have been found there, and it's really hard for us to understand. There's been thousands of tombs found around Jerusalem. It's a very common thing. I mean, how long have people lived there? How many civilizations have existed in Jerusalem? Not even just the Jews, but years and years and years and years before the Jews were even in the land of Israel, right? So there are tombs and all kinds of artifacts, and a large portion of them have been grave robbed, and then those things get taken and sold on the black market and things, and it's a very lucrative business. But there's tons of tombs, and so examples of this that we talked about. So these are ones more so in Jerusalem, and again, you can see these guys standing up here in more of probably like a modern cemetery, just for the scale. These are tombs of the rich people in, you know, the first couple of centuries. You see, they're almost like tiny little temples. Like, look how great our family is and how much money we have and all of these kind of things. And you notice that they're very Roman and Greek in their style because, you know, the affluent people were trying to show how important they were in this society. But you can kind of see that there's this top, and then there's almost like, what's the basement? And this is where the bodies would be. So this is sort of like, not a hangout spot, you know, but it would be the place where you kind of enter in and remember the family, more so of like a mausoleum type, where it's a nice sort of space, and then in the bottom is sort of the catacombs. And so this is an example of what some of those tombs looked like. And again, there's been a bunch of them found that are fancy like this. And then we discussed more so of what Jesus' tomb probably looked like. I'll come on this side now. More of what Jesus' tomb looked like. And so just piecing together the evidence of what the Gospels say and what it said about Joseph's tomb. So it was a new tomb. What do we mean by new tomb? What's the point in those details?
Had not been laid, the body laid in.
Yeah, nobody had been laid in it yet. It hadn't been used. And so part of that is it probably just had something like this first room in it because they didn't need the extra space. So the way that they did it was they would just start with the room, and then as the family needed more and more space, they'd keep digging and keep digging. And that's what we started to see on Wednesday. And so Jesus was probably just laid in something like this. And so this is a bench-style tomb that we talked about. Sometimes instead of a bench, there would be those holes in the wall, just kind of outlining. So maybe he was in one of those holes. But either way, you can see that this is probably more so of what Jesus was laid in versus what we're going to look at in pictures. And then does anybody remember, was the very clear detail of the round seal to the tomb, was that significant?
They weren't as common because it was much more expensive.
Yeah, it was a lot more expensive. So they weren't as common. So estimates that I've read from archaeologists and the hundreds, thousands of examples that they found is like about 10 to 15% of the tombs would have a round gate because it was more expensive. And as we talked about, this would probably be on a ramp, so it's hard to push up, but then it would slide down and sort of seal the tomb. And so that, if there was only a few of them, had those.
Rich people.
The really rich people. One of which was, according to these, Joseph of Arimathea. So Joseph of Arimathea was one of the very wealthy people in this tomb, and so he had the means to bury Jesus and all of those. But we looked at some of these details. Again, roll the great stone, things like that. When the women enter the tomb, they see someone sitting on the right side, so on one of these benches, maybe outside the hole, something like that. So these are just, again, what we said were incidental details. You can tell the gospel writers are not making a big deal about this because they understood it. This was everyday life for them. When they go visit their family tomb or a friend's tomb or something, this is what they looked like. And so he's sitting on the right side, the body is missing, and he said, you're looking for Jesus who's crucified. He's risen, he's not here. You could see the spot where they laid him. He's not here. And in other cases, we see that when the disciples go in and they look into the tomb, and you can see this idea of stooping in because they're going down into the ground, what do they see? What's sitting there either on the bench or inside one of the holes? It's in the picture. Yeah, the lens. So what would have wrapped Jesus' face? What would have wrapped his body? They're sitting there, and in John, it said, the face cloth is folded up in a place by itself. Do you unwrap a body and carry it out naked if you're trying to steal it? The answer to that would be no. I can tell you're not grave robbers. Because that would be drawing a lot of attention, and there'd be all kinds of, that's gross, for one thing. And so the point is that Jesus' body is gone. Something weird happened to it, and they're all confused as we talk about. Andrew.
There was some precedent for unwrapping bodies because often they were buried with jewelry or amulets or things tucked into the wrappings. So, and this maybe was more common in some other cultures that had grave robbers too. They would strip the body, but to neatly fold and arrange things after the fact would make no sense if that was their goal.
Yeah, so later we talked about it a little bit. So the way that the Jews typically did their burials is they would, put the body in there initially. There'd be like a week-long funeral. And then a year later they would come and they would unwrap all the bodies and things like that because it would just be bones at that point. So if there were things, they would collect them and all of that. And that would be the point when then they're transferred to the bone boxes that we talked about. Okay, so any questions about any of this so far? I know this is mostly review of what we talked about. So then the actual tomb that we're looking at, the tomb of the shroud, can we remember why it was called the tomb of the shroud? Not the Shroud of Turin. I'm not even going to talk about that in this class, sorry.
Because they found a still wrapped body.
Yeah, because they found someone still in their shroud, is basically the idea. And what it makes this tomb famous, of course, is the person still wrapped and still sealed in that compartment was a leper, and they were able to do, genetic and biological testing on it and show that this person had died of leprosy. And so it was physical confirmation of what the Gospels and different things had said. But this is the tomb that we were looking at. And so Jerusalem is this way. We're southwest a little bit. Trying to picture. Let's just say south. South of Jerusalem. You can see some of the city there. And there's a guy that you might not be able to see if you're far back, sitting on top of this rock. And the tomb entrance is a hole down here. And so what you don't see is what we saw in those other pictures, that on top of this rock, there would have been one of those big structures, like the tiny little temple sort of deal. Big structure, like mausoleum type, for one to show where the tomb was, to show the prominence of the family, so on, but that's gone. We discussed on Wednesday how this area has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt probably hundreds, if not thousands of times over the time period that people have lived here. And so all that's gone, but there was this hole, And this was where I saw most of the smiles and things. Do you remember how was this tomb found?
Boy Scout fell in there.
Yeah, Boy Scout went in there. So a couple Boy Scouts just happened to be walking with an archaeologist, and a Boy Scout climbs into the hole and says, "Hey, look what I found." And the archaeologist loses his mind, of course, and he sleeps in the tomb so that nobody will come in there and mess with it. And they started excavations on it. But this was part of what we looked at. This is the diagram of what the tomb looks like from the inside here. And so what we just saw, the entrance there, the guy would have been sitting up here, and on top of this rock would be that structure. And so think about that picture with the bench-style tomb and the circle rock that we said probably looks more of like what Jesus was buried in. So they would have started with something like that, and then as the family needed to expand it, they would dig more and more and more, and they need more space, and so they dig more and more. And so again, we're just seeing like the basement, crawl space, something like that, of these tombs. So you've got this upper chamber, this passage, this lower chamber, and so we're going to look at pictures of all of these, which we started with. And I messed with them a little bit, so they should hopefully be maybe a little more visible. And this is another, just the side shot of what it looks like. And so you can see the entrance, the upper chamber, that passageway to the lower level, and then the lower level. And at the very bottom is where they would put all those bone boxes. So your bodies usually start up here, and then once they're transported, they get stored down here. So the basement of the basement. Any questions or comments so far? Again, I know this is a lot of lecture, just I don't assume that you have access to some of this information or know that it's there, so I have to cover a lot of ground. So if you're wondering something or you have questions or what I'm saying is not making sense, or you're saying, I don't know how to picture what's going on here, please let me know, because I know I'm doing a lot of talking today. So here's a picture. And it was a little better. Andrew, you mind killing the lights in here? We talked about on Wednesday doing that. So I want you to be able to see what's going on. Okay, so nobody fall asleep, right? So I messed with the picture a little bit so it's not as clear, obviously, because I want you to be able to see. So this is that upper chamber, the first room. What does the bright light here in the middle tell us that this probably is? Yeah, this is the way to the outside. So this would be that hole that you climb down, and then this is the first room that you get into. And so remember, we said on Wednesday, when it says that the disciples go to the tomb, and they stoop down and look inside, it's because they have to climb down into this cave. So we don't really do that. You know, if we have a mausoleum, you know, you're looking into a wall, or we look at a tombstone or something. But for instance, you know, in John chapter 20, when Peter and John are looking at the tomb, they both go, and it says they stoop down, they climb down into the tomb. And that's why, because this is what that would look like. And so when they go down into the tomb, the first room's probably not this big. Maybe it was, but probably not, because there wouldn't be much reason for Joseph to have all this dug out already. But then they're seeing, once they get in here, they may be seeing some of these holes, which this is hard to see. So there's this little tunnel room right here. There's another one on this side. And those would be those compartments where they would put the bodies initially. They'd wrap them up and they would slide them in there. So if you think about like a morgue on TV, a little morbid, but they have those big drawers that they slide the bodies in and out of on the cop shows. That's kind of like that, except not the sliding drawer. You'd have to have somebody muscle it in there. And so that's what that is. Another one for probably one of the initial ones before they dug down into here. And then this is that tunnel down to the lower level that we talked about. And for those who are claustrophobic, it's probably going to get worse from here, so I will warn you ahead of time. So here's a picture of one of those burial niches that we talked about, those holes. And so it's literally just a shelf carved into the wall. And so you'd wrap a body, you would slide them in there, and then if you can see, there's like this square relief around the hole, and you can kind of see where there's a shelf. So they would put the stone doors on there to seal the tomb, and it would keep it shut. And so this is one of the ones, I believe this is actually the one where they found the leper in, if I'm remembering what everything looks like. I think the door is down on the ground right here, but this would have been, I think, the one where they found the leper. So that door would seal, and then and so the body was pretty well preserved, and that's why they were able to find the skin and the hair samples and then do the testing on it, because it didn't decay as much. So it's possible that Jesus would have been slid in something like that. And I did not put it on here, there's pictures of people who have climbed in and then they're taking pictures looking out to say, oh, this is what Jesus would have seen. And I showed it to Salem, and she's claustrophobic and she freaked out a little bit. So I thought, I probably won't show that just in case other people get uncomfortable too. But these are those burial niches. So this is the basement here, and this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time. This one was already pretty clear. So here's that tunnel from the top, so coming down, and it would have been really fun. I was thinking about it yesterday. I don't know how that guy slept by himself in this thing overnight. I mean, at least bugs and snakes and all that I would have been worried about. So you can see that there's this door and the little step, and here's more of these burial closet niches. And so sometimes when you go into it's hard to see because of all the dirt, but sometimes there would be this trough in the middle, and then a shelf on either side where they could put a body here, and then there was room for the slave or the servant to walk in the middle and not have to climb over the bodies. And so sometimes they were big enough that they could have one on each side. Here's one of the doors. So we talked about that square door that would fit into like the relief cut here and seal it up. And so if Jesus was put in one of these niches, he'd have the round seal on the very outside, and then probably one of these two, unless he was on one of the benches. But these are what the doors look like. And they're there. Sometimes they would have a name written on them, sometimes not. And then can we see this square hole cut out here in the ground? Can everybody see that? It's literally just like a rectangular hole cut out in the ground. Can you think about why maybe that would be there? It's very intentional. This is just brainstorming. I'm not going to say I looked at this and knew immediately what it was. I had to learn from the archaeologists. Any guesses as to what that would be, though? Andrew?
Maybe it's a little gross, but my first thought is like drainage. Something where...
That is gross, no. Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but you took it there. Andrew and I are good enough friends that I can just say, no, that's not right. So it is not drainage.
Would you set the ossuary box there? Would you remove
No, so it actually doesn't have anything to do with the dead. Chip.
I thought the same thing as Andrew, so
Bunch of sickos in here.
is it so you can lay the door down and then pull the door back from?
No, I see why you would say that, because it looks like it would be the same shape. But it has to do with the mourners. Right.
Is there a bench there for the living to sit there and mourn their dead?
Not a bench, but they would actually just climb down into that hole.
Climb down the hole?
Yeah. So one thing that we don't really do this today. It's not culturally acceptable in a lot of places. Do you know the way that they would pray in the first century in societies like that? Did they usually get on their knees and fold their hands like we talk about and draw? Face on the ground, but a lot of times they would be standing and they would raise their hands up and look to heaven and then pray. And it's not very tall in here. This is, I want to say, this is probably like 6'5", something. The guy that I watched the video, he's probably 6'2", and he barely was able to clear his head. But this was a spot so that they could climb down and pray and mourn over their dead relatives. It was really interesting. They took all the time to do that so that they could stand there and pray, because that's what they did. These would be spots for mourning and for worship. Again, like we would go to a cemetery and do a service, this was their equivalent. They would go in there and they would say prayers. There would be that initial funeral, and then they would do the whole thing again after it was just bones and they were going to move the body. But this is a prayer pit, basically. And then there's another detail I think is really cool. You see these black streak marks here? What do those look like? Little black marks around the room. Greg?
They found oil lamps or something.
Yeah, that's soot from oil lamps. And so there would be this little shelf, and I think maybe sometimes it would be metal, which is why it's not there. It would have been looted. But they would put their lamps, oil lamps here, on these reliefs so that they could see while they were worshiping and mourning and doing the things with the bodies. And the soot is still on the wall. I just think that is so cool. You can see the actual evidence of the people there and what they were doing, that they would sit here and this was their flashlight while they were down in this hole in the ground and worshiping and mourning. And so this is what a lot of the tombs looked like. You have any questions or anything that stands out to you about this? Andrew?
I think it's just interesting the number of things that point to the fact that they visited and revisited these places.
Yeah.
Tombs weren't meant to just be sealed off and then you'd never go in there again, but they were places to visit. And so the fact that Joseph provided a tomb for Jesus was kind of doubly a measure of respect, because he was allowing Jesus' followers, if they didn't know Jesus was going to raise, he was still giving them a chance to be able to honor him and do that
Yeah.
in years to come. Where any other way, Jesus had no money, there would have been no chance of them to have a spot to go and mourn Jesus
Yeah.
in the future.
Letting the family and the followers go. And that's probably what the women were doing on Sunday morning. So Friday night, the Sabbath is starting. Saturday, you can't go to the Sabbath. Saturday night, when the Sabbath's over, you're not going to go to the tomb in the middle of the night. And so the first chance that they have to go and honor Jesus is Sunday morning. And so they go to the tomb to do that. They bring the different things with them. They probably would have had their lamps with them, and they would go into the tomb, and they would pray and mourn over Jesus. And yeah, Joseph was letting the people do that by putting him in the tomb and giving him honor. Anything else that's interesting or questions that we have? Nothing? I had a ton of questions when I learned this at first. Anybody before I go back to Andrew?
Is this all hewn stone, the lower level, or is that?
Yeah, this is hand-carved rock. Yeah. It's limestone, actually, which is part of the reason that the bodies would desiccate and not just putrefy. I know, sorry, that's gross, but that's a lot of the reason why the bodies would preserve so well, is because the limestone has lye and different things, and it would suck all the moisture out. But yeah, a lot of somebody's probably crawled down and carved all of this out by hand and then took all of the rock out. And so you can see why you had to be rich to have something like this, especially to this scale. Andrew?
So we've seen examples of the tombs existing within a family and being reused. Is there evidence of tombs getting completely repurposed, like a new family takes over and just buys a pre-existing tomb? Or
I don't know.
I mean, I'm sure with thousands of years of history, you eventually have kind of a scraping and a replacement of where people bury their dead.
Yeah, I haven't come across anybody talking about that. If I think about it through the lens of the law of Moses, this might be off base because I'm just doing this off the top of my head. So say, for instance, there was a dead person in a house or some kind of skin problem or something. The priest could go in and purify the house so that people could still live there. Maybe, again, I don't know, maybe they could do the same thing with a tomb and go through and ritually purify it so that people could use it. I don't know. That's a good question. Again, there's a bunch of these, and eventually, right, you'd have to run out of space because Jerusalem's not that big. But these are all over the place.
I guess what made me think of it is these examples, even the fairly modest ones, they're so much larger than what we're used to storing our dead. And
Yeah.
so it just struck me, kind of the space issue of, with thousands of years of history, how do you have, obviously there was more space back then, but it just made me curious how they would reuse that space.
Yeah, we do it differently because we have, the plots of land. Sometimes people are stacked underground or above ground in a mausoleum. They didn't exactly do it that way.
You get to a point in Roman history where instead of the bone boxes, you've seen like the catacombs where they just
Yeah.
literally
I was thinking of the catacombs under Paris.
arrange
Yeah.
like the bones
Mhm.
into those architectural shapes
Yeah, absolutely.
as a space saving measure.
Things that I'm sure you never thought you'd have to think about. Where do we put the bodies in Jerusalem, right? But that's life. We have to figure out what to do with the dead. And part of this is you can see that they dealt with death much more directly than we do in our culture. We have embalming and we dress them up and we have open caskets and then we put them in the ground and we never have to look at them again. And that was not the case in their societies, where they were facing it and then they would be faced with it again when they go back to honor them. And there was this constant reminder, especially as you were seeing all of these extravagant structures pointing to tombs, there's this constant reminder of death. And we like to tuck it away and clean it and make it all shiny so that we don't have to think about it. But that's not how they did. Anything else? Does this help to picture what's going on? You see more of the details, right? Of why they had to go down and exactly what they were doing and, some of those things that maybe we wouldn't understand. Why somebody could be sitting to the right of where Jesus' body was. Why they were worried about who's going to open the tomb for us and the ceiling and all of those kind of things. And why it was such a big deal that Jesus was buried in a tomb, because it was a really expensive, important asset. You didn't just throw these around. And so you can see Joseph's opinion of Jesus must have been very high to essentially, in some ways, waste all that money on him, because on the face of it, then he wouldn't have been able to use that for himself and his family, according to the law, at least straightforward. Maybe, again, there were some other things that they did. But he was given a lot of honor. And this was odd, remember, because Jesus was executed as a criminal, an insurrectionist or a revolutionary, a threat to the Roman Empire, at least in the official charges, as the king of the Jews, but out of jealousy and hatred and his threat to the leader's way of life. And so for someone to give him the honor and to bury him like this and allow for people to come and mourn him says a lot, for one, about some people's opinion of who Jesus was, right? And you can see those struggles in the stories. So I hope that kind of helps. And then I want us to think about this question and give you a couple minutes, or maybe a couple minutes to think about it. How does seeing this tomb and the information around it help you to appreciate the account of Jesus' tomb as told by the gospel writers? So I want to make sure we're applying this. It's not just cool information. How does this help you to appreciate what we're being told about Jesus' burial in his tomb by the gospel writers? Emma.
I think it's just cool to see all of the little details that they say that are just passing comments to them,
Right.
how we stooped in to see it. And also whenever we were looking at it, you see the one apostle who runs up and doesn't go in. And that's always been weird to me, because in my mind it's just kind of like an archway in a house.
You just
It's
walk in.
Why aren't
Yeah.
you going
Yeah.
in? But it would have been a stoop down, fall into the tomb.
Yeah, just
stepping
crawl down.
into
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting to see all of their little details that were just oh yeah, and he stooped down to look in, which is just what he did. But to us to see it now, it's oh yeah, he had to stoop down to look in, because it's not just this big archway that he could have walked in.
You had to go underground, right? You have to crawl down into this creepy little hole where you know that a dead person is laying. I mean, it's... So what does that tell us about how the gospel writers are approaching the story that they're providing?
They're just reporting facts.
They're just saying what happened, right? Again, a lot of these little details, they're not embellishing it or pointing all of this attention to it to say, hey, look at how believable this is. We have to dig through some of that because they took it for granted, because that was their world. They're just telling us the story very matter-of-factly. And again, once you get to like after the year 100 and there start to be more like gospel accounts written, they don't look like that. So like the Gospel of Peter, for instance, is one that was written in the 100s. And the soldiers and the different people, they come to the tomb and a cross comes out of the tomb and is levitating and starts talking to them and following them around. That's different than what Mark and Matthew and Luke and John are saying. It's very different. And so if you're looking for that legendary development, usually it's about 2 to 3 generations after the thing happens, and that puts us exactly at that point where we start seeing those really weird stories like that, where the cross comes out and talks to everybody. So they're just telling us the story, right? They're just reporting what happened. So somebody else, how does seeing this help you to appreciate Jesus' burial as the gospel writers are telling us? Jeff?
It gives us an assurance that what God has put down in His Word is fact.
Yeah.
It's true. And we can base our eternal life on that situation.
Yeah.
And it's true that Jesus did rise from the tomb.
I mean, we're sitting here 2,000 years later on the other side of the planet, completely different culture. We don't speak their language. We have these words written down to us, translated from another language, and yet we can see these things and know exactly what happened. Right? You can view this and be like, oh, yeah, I can see exactly what was going on. And the fact that this is reliable and we can know, and that's what we're talking about with these facts, is the core information. Even if someone wants to say, oh, the Bible's not reliable, you don't have to even believe the Bible to agree with the facts that we've looked at. And that's the point, is that even people who don't believe in God agree with these things. But again, it shows that the core of it is true. And if the core of it is true, what does that mean as we go out in the layers? And we'll talk about some of that in the next couple weeks. Somebody else, Greg?
If you were looking for conspiracy, you have to find conspirators.
Yeah.
And all of these things are written in such a way that when you look at what you would call the leaders of this movement, were as frightened and scattered and ridiculous as anyone else in terms of they couldn't even figure out what was going on, let alone engineer the whole thing. So,
Right.
you know, it wasn't like a bunch of disciples said, hey, we got to remember that verse back in Isaiah that talks about, you know, dying with thieves or dying with the wicked, I guess it says.
And buried with the rich
buried
man.
with the rich, buried with the rich, or buried, yeah, with the rich. So we got to make sure we ask Joseph to jump in and be part of this. These guys didn't talk to Joseph very at the end. They didn't run the same circles. I mean, there were council members, but there's no evidence of any conspiracy or mastermind in any of this to make it all play out the way it played out.
Right. Stan, can you turn the lights on? I forgot. You all are sitting in the dark. But yeah, with what Greg is saying, if someone wants to say this whole thing was a conspiracy, you have to have something to back that up. You can't just claim something like that and be like, oh, this is what happened. There's not any evidence of that. I mean, again, the people who are writing these stories about their friends and colleagues that they were working with, they said they went and they saw these tombs and they were confused and thought someone stole Jesus' body. And they said, Mary came to, Peter and John and the rest of them and said, they've taken the Lord and we don't know where they put him. Conspiracy there? No, they're confused and they're afraid and they don't understand any of this. And even after Jesus presents himself to them and explains these things over 40 days. Do they understand it all then? No, not even close. And that's the leaders of our church, right, that started everything and got it off the ground and took it to the world, right? So if you're going to come up with a story, that's how you do it. You show how inadequate and afraid and ignorant they are. No, but that's what happened, and that's the real thing. And then Jesus empowers them through the Spirit to do all of this. Okay, we can take maybe one more person if you want to talk about it, and then I want to introduce the next section. Anybody else on? Yeah, Andrew.
I was going to say, with several of the other things in this class, it's just really humanizing of the characters in the story. I mean, something as simple as seeing the landmarks. You feel the presence of real people who lived in a real time.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it not feel like a fairy tale where it's a story or a mythology where everything's clean and neat. This was normal. This was just the way people lived. It fits with human history, people living in a real place in real time. And none of these people were prepared to be a part of something grand or special. And they were going about their lives like they always had, not prepared to be a part of something special.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of this shows, we read all of it and we know the stories, but sometimes it takes a little bit of an extra jump to realize these are real people and real things that happen. And part of looking at, pictures like this and all of that is to put it back into the real world and see, yeah, wow, this is what occurred. And so I think about that leper that was left in the tomb. I mean, there's multiple reasons why 2,000 years later he was still there. It could have been he was a leper, and so his family didn't want to go and handle his bones because they didn't want to get leprosy. Or maybe he's left there, and in that time, Jerusalem's destroyed, and his entire family is killed or forced to another land, and then he's just left there. I mean, those are real things. And you can see, the people that were in there, and you can understand what the gospel writers and the disciples would have been facing when they come to these tombs and they see this, and the body is gone, and all of the various shades of what that would mean. This was the real world. And being so removed from it, that's sometimes hard to remember. Okay. So I want to transition into the next thing here. So what we're going to talk about, so I'm going to introduce this and then we'll really start with it on Wednesday. We're going to move, so we've looked at all of the information and we're going to talk about, okay, what are we saying explains all of these facts? So this is no secret. Somebody can give that answer. What are we saying explains all of these facts the best? That what happened? Jesus rose from the dead. We're saying that the best explanation for all that is that Jesus rose from the dead, and that's what the original disciples said. That he was buried, he was raised, and he appeared, right? And so that's what we're saying fits the information the best. But there have been a lot of other explanations that have been offered and objections to what we're saying. And I don't think we should hide from those at all, because what we're going to do is look at some of those alternate explanations that have been proposed, and we're going to see why those don't stack up to the information, why Jesus' resurrection is by far the best explanation for what we've been talking about. And so we're going to look at things about, like, it was a fraud, someone stole the body, or the fact that they were hallucinating, or that Jesus didn't actually die, or it's just a legend. All of those kinds of things I want us to look at head on, because we can see that they don't stand up to what we're talking about. And so that's going to be really the bulk of the rest of the class, and then we'll take a little bit to reflect a little bit on everything that we've talked about. But the next couple of weeks is going to be looking at these alternate theories and objections. And we'll start with that on Wednesday, and all you need to do is just bring your beautiful selves. Okay? Any questions before we dismiss? Okay, thank you, everybody.